Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary secrets. What begins as a simple conversation between two strangers can unravel mysteries that have been buried for decades. In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where everyone knows everyone else's business, one woman's whispered confession to a weathered rancher would shake the very foundation of what people believed about truth, justice, and the power of redemption. This is not just a story about secrets. It's about the moment when the past collides with the present so forcefully that lives are forever changed. When Sarah Martinez stepped onto the Broken Arrow Ranch that scorching Tuesday afternoon, she carried with her a burden that had been eating away at her soul for 23 years. And when she finally found the courage to speak those 4 simple words to rancher Jake Thompson, neither of them could have predicted how those words would ripple through their small community like stones thrown into still water. What makes someone confess their darkest secret to a complete stranger? What drives a person to seek redemption after more than 2 decades of silence? And what happens when that confession threatens to destroy not just one life, but the carefully constructed peace of an entire town? The answers lie in the scorching heat of a Texas summer, in the eyes of a man who has seen more than his share of heartbreak, and in the trembling voice of a woman who finally decided that living with the truth was better than dying with a lie. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after 2 in the afternoon, cutting through the shimmering heat waves like a ghost materializing from the Texas prairie. Jake Thompson squinted from beneath the brim of his weathered Stetson, watching as the small sedan wound its way down the gravel road toward his ranch. Visitors were rare at the Broken Arrow Ranch, especially on weekdays when most sensible folks stayed indoors, hiding from the merciless July sun. Jake set down the fence post he'd been wrestling with and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. At 58, he'd been working this land for more than 3 decades, and he could count on one hand the number of unexpected visitors who'd brought good news. The car was unfamiliar, a dusty blue Honda that had seen better years. With out-of-state plates he couldn't quite make out through the dust and distance. The vehicle pulled to a stop near the main house, a modest 2-story structure that Jake's grandfather had built with his own hands back in 1947. The engine ticked and pinged in the afternoon heat as it cooled, and for a long moment nothing happened. Jake found himself holding his breath, waiting to see who would emerge from the car. There was something about the stillness, the way the vehicle sat there like a held breath, that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Finally, the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 45 years old, with shoulder-length dark hair that caught the sunlight in auburn highlights. She wore a simple blue sundress and sandals, clothes that marked her as someone from the city, someone not accustomed to the harsh realities of ranch life. But it was her movements that caught Jake's attention. She moved like someone carrying a heavy burden, each step deliberate and careful, as if she were walking through a minefield. Jake pulled off his work gloves and started walking toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. The woman stood beside her car for a moment, looking around at the sprawling landscape, the weathered barn, the horses grazing in the distance. There was something in her expression that Jake recognized, though he couldn't quite place it. It was the look of someone who was searching for something, or perhaps running from something. As he drew closer, Jake could see that she was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her dress, and she kept glancing back at her car, as if considering whether to get back in and drive away. Jake had seen that look before, usually on the faces of people who were about to deliver bad news or ask for favors they knew they had no right to request. "Afternoon, ma'am," Jake called out when he was still about 20 feet away, not wanting to startle her. "Can I help you with something?" The woman turned toward him, and Jake got his first clear look at her face. She had dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness, and there were lines around them that spoke of years of worry and sleepless nights. But there was also something else there, a determination that hadn't been completely worn away by whatever burden she carried. "Are you Jake Thompson?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she was clearly trying to control. "That's right," Jake replied, stopping a respectful distance away. "And you are?" The woman took a deep breath, and Jake could see her gathering her courage. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I've driven a very long way to talk to you, Mr. Thompson, about something that happened 23 years ago." Jake felt his stomach tighten. 23 years ago. The year that everything in his life had gone sideways, the year that had changed the trajectory of not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in Cedar Ridge. The year that people in town still talked about in hushed whispers, when they talked about it at all. "I'm not sure I understand," Jake said carefully, though he was beginning to suspect that he understood all too well. Sarah Martinez looked down at her hands, then back up at Jake. "Mr. Seth Thompson, I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to tell you something about the night Emily Morrison died. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Jake felt as if someone had just punched him in the gut, driving all the air from his lungs. Emily Morrison. Sweet 17-year-old Emily Morrison, who had died in a car accident on a rainy night in April 1999. The girl whose death had torn the heart out of Cedar Ridge and left scars that had never fully healed. "Ma'am," Jake said, his voice hoarse. "I think maybe you should, please." Sarah interrupted, stepping forward slightly. "I know how this must sound. I know you probably think I'm some kind of crazy person, but I've been carrying this weight for 23 years and I can't carry it anymore. I need to tell someone the truth about what really happened that night." Jake stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. The official investigation into Emily's death had concluded that it was a tragic accident, a young girl driving too fast on wet roads, losing control of her car and hitting a tree. Case closed. But Jake had never quite believed it, had always felt like there were pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. And now this woman was standing in his driveway, claiming to know something about the truth. "Why me?" Jake asked. "Why come to me with this?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Because you were the one who found her," she said quietly. "Because you were the one who held her hand while she was dying. Because you're the only person in this town who ever seemed to care about finding out what really happened to her." Jake remembered that night as if it had happened yesterday. He'd been driving home from a late meeting in town when he'd seen the wreckage. Emily's car, a red Honda Civic that her parents had bought her for her 16th birthday, wrapped around an old oak tree on the side of Highway 287. He'd been the first one on the scene, had pulled Emily from the wreckage and held her as she died, her blood soaking into his shirt as he whispered words of comfort that he hoped would somehow reach her through the haze of pain and shock. "She said something to me that night," Jake said, the words coming out without his conscious decision to speak them. "Right before she died. Something that never made sense." Sarah's face went pale. "What did she say?" Jake closed his eyes, remembering. "She kept saying I'm sorry, over and over again. But then, right at the end, she grabbed my shirt and pulled me close, and she whispered, 'Tell them it wasn't an accident. Tell them about the man in the truck.'" Sarah's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she reached out to steady herself against her car. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, she actually said that." "You knew about the truck?" Jake asked, stepping closer. Sarah nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I was there," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was there that night, and I saw what happened, and I've been running from it ever since." Jake felt the world shift around him, as if the very ground beneath his feet had become unstable. "What are you saying?" Sarah looked up at him, and Jake could see 23 years of guilt and anguish in her eyes. "I'm saying that Emily Morrison didn't die in an accident. She was murdered. And I saw who did it." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy and choking. Jake stared at Sarah, trying to process what she had just told him. All these years he'd suspected that there was more to Emily's death than what the official report had said. But murder? The idea was almost too big, too terrible to comprehend. "Who?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That's what I came here to tell you. But Mr. Hazel Thompson. Once I tell you this, there's no going back. This secret has the power to destroy lives, to tear this town apart. Are you sure you want to know?" Jake thought about Emily Morrison, about the bright, beautiful girl who had died too young, whose death had haunted him for more than 2 decades. He thought about her parents, Margaret and Robert Morrison, who had never really recovered from losing their only child. He thought about the questions that had plagued him all these years, the feeling that justice had never been served. "Yes," he said firmly, "I need to know." Sarah took a shaky breath. "The man who killed Emily Morrison is someone everyone in this town trusts. Someone who's been living a lie for 23 years, building a life on top of a secret that should have destroyed him long ago." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Just tell me who it was." Sarah met his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. It was Sheriff Robert Hawkins. "Your sheriff killed Emily Morrison, and then he covered it up. And I'm the only witness left alive." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Sheriff Hawkins had been a pillar of the community for as long as Jake could remember. He'd been the one who had handled Emily's case, who had comforted her family, who had assured the town that justice would be served if there was any justice to be served. The idea that he could have been the one responsible for her death was almost impossible to process. But as Jake looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw truth there. Raw, painful, undeniable truth. "Tell me everything," he said, and as the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty ranch yard, Sarah Martinez began to unravel a secret that had been buried for 23 years. A secret that would change everything Jake thought he knew about justice, truth, and the people he trusted. Sarah Martinez closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to that terrible night in April 1990, when she had been 22 years old and working as a waitress at Mel's Diner, on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. It had been raining heavily that night, the kind of spring storm that turned the Texas roads into rivers and made driving dangerous for even the most experienced drivers. "I was driving home from my shift," Sarah began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving a memory they'd tried desperately to forget. "It was almost midnight, and the roads were terrible. I was taking Highway 287 because it was the fastest way back to my apartment in town." Jake listened intently, trying to imagine the scene. Highway 287 was a lonely stretch of road that cut through open countryside between Cedar Ridge and the neighboring town of Millbrook. At night, especially during a storm, it could be a dangerous place. "I was driving slow because of the rain," Sarah continued. "Maybe 30 miles an hour when most people would have been doing 50 or 60. That's the only reason I saw what happened. If I'd been going any faster, I would have missed it completely." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at Jake. "Do you know what Dead Man's Curve is?" Jake nodded grimly. Dead Man's Curve was a sharp bend in Highway 287, about 5 miles outside of town, where the road curved around a small hill. Over the years, there had been several accidents there, though Emily's had been the most serious. The curve was poorly lit and could be treacherous in bad weather. "I was approaching the curve when I saw headlights coming toward me," Sarah said. "But something was wrong. The vehicle was weaving, swerving back and forth across the center line. At first, I thought maybe it was someone who'd been drinking, so I slowed down even more and pulled as far to the right as I could." Sarah paused, taking a shaky breath. Jake could see that reliving this memory was taking a physical toll on her. Her hands were trembling, and there was a fine sheen of perspiration on her forehead despite the fact that they were standing in the shade. "As the vehicle got closer, I could see it was a pickup truck. A big dark-colored pickup truck. And whoever was driving it wasn't just weaving because of the rain or because they were drunk. They were deliberately trying to force another car off the road." Jake felt his blood run cold. "Another car?" "Emily's car," Sarah whispered. "That little red Honda Civic." I could see her trying to get away from the truck, trying to stay on the road. But the truck was bigger and faster, and whoever was driving it was determined. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I pulled over and stopped, thinking maybe I could help somehow, but I was too far away, and everything happened so fast. The truck forced Emily's car off the road and she hit that big oak tree. The impact was terrible. Mr. Thompson. The sound. I'll never forget that sound." Jake closed his eyes, remembering his own arrival at the scene. The twisted metal, the broken glass, the smell of gasoline and blood. "What happened to the truck?" "That's when I saw him," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The driver of the truck got out and walked over to Emily's car. He looked inside, checking to see if she was still alive. And when he turned toward the road, the headlights from my car lit up his face." "Sheriff Hawkins," Jake said. Sarah nodded. "Robert Hawkins. I recognized him immediately. Everyone in town knew the sheriff." He stood there for a moment, looking at Emily's car, and I could see him thinking. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. He just left her there to die. Jake felt a rage building inside him that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The idea that Hawkins had deliberately run Emily off the road was horrific enough, but to leave her there bleeding and dying was beyond comprehension. "Why didn't you come forward?" Jake asked, though he was already beginning to understand the answer. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Come forward? Against the sheriff? Mr. Teller. Thompson, I was 22, working as a waitress, barely making enough money to pay rent on a studio apartment. Sheriff Hawkins was one of the most powerful men in the county. Who was going to believe me? She was right, and Jake knew it. In 1999, Robert Hawkins had been sheriff for almost 10 years. He was respected, well-connected, and had the backing of the entire law enforcement community. A young woman working a minimum wage job would have had no credibility against him. "But that's not the only reason I stayed quiet," Sarah continued. 2 days after Emily's death, I got a visit at my apartment. Sheriff Hawkins came to see me." Jake felt his stomach drop. "He knew you'd seen him?" "He'd figured it out. He told me he'd checked all the vehicle registration records for cars that had passed through that area that night. Mine was the only one that matched a local resident. He said he'd done some checking up on me and discovered that I had a record. A record? Sarah nodded, shame evident in her voice. When I was 19, I'd been arrested for possession of marijuana. It was just a small amount, something a boyfriend had left in my car, but I'd pleaded guilty because I couldn't afford a lawyer. It was a misdemeanor, but Hawkins made it clear that he could make my life very difficult if I caused trouble for him. Jake could picture the scene. A young woman, alone and vulnerable, being threatened by a corrupt sheriff who held all the power. It was a classic case of intimidation, and it had worked perfectly. He told me that if I ever said anything about what I'd seen that night, he would make sure I was charged with something much worse than possession. He said he'd plant evidence, make up witnesses, do whatever it took to destroy my life. And I believed him. So you left town, Jake said. The very next week, I packed everything I owned into that same car and drove to California. I changed my name, started over, tried to forget what had happened. But you can't really forget something like that. It follows you everywhere you go. Sarah looked out across the ranch, her eyes distant. I tried to build a new life. I got married, had children, started a career. For a while, I thought I could put it behind me. But the guilt never went away. Every year, on the anniversary of Emily's death, I would read about it online, see the memorial services, watch her parents grieving for a daughter they thought had died in an accident. What changed? Jake asked. Why come forward now? Sarah turned back to him, and Jake could see a new determination in her eyes. My daughter is 17 now, the same age Emily was when she died. And last month, she was in a car accident. Not serious, just a fender bender. But it made me realize how precious life is, how quickly it can be taken away. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I started thinking about Emily Morrison, about how she never got the chance to grow up, to fall in love, to have children of her own. And I realized that by staying silent, I was as responsible for her death as Hawkins was. I was letting him get away with murder. Jake could understand her reasoning, but there was something else bothering him. Sarah, why come to me specifically? Why not go to the state police or the FBI? Sarah's expression darkened. Because Robert Hawkins is still the sheriff, Mr. Thompson. He's been re-elected 5 times since 1999. He has friends in high places, connections throughout law enforcement. If I'd gone to the authorities, he would have found out about it before I even finished giving my statement. She was right again, Jake realized. Hawkins did have connections throughout the state. He was well respected, well liked, and had built a reputation as an honest, effective law enforcement officer. An accusation from a woman with a criminal record who had waited 23 years to come forward would be easy to dismiss. But you, Sarah continued, you're different. You were there that night. You held Emily while she died. You heard her say that it wasn't an accident. If anyone would believe me, if anyone would fight for the truth, it would be you. Jake looked at Sarah Martinez, this woman who had carried such a terrible burden for so many years, and felt a mixture of admiration and sadness. She had risked everything to come forward, knowing that her revelation could destroy not just Hawkins, but potentially her own life as well. What exactly are you asking me to do? Jake asked. I want to make this right, Sarah said simply. I want Emily Morrison to have justice. I want her parents to know the truth about what happened to their daughter. And I want Robert Hawkins to pay for what he did. Jake nodded slowly. That's not going to be easy. We're talking about bringing down a sheriff who's been in power for almost 30 years. He's going to fight back, and he's going to fight dirty. I know, Sarah said, but I can't run anymore. I can't let Emily's death go unavenged for another day. Will you help me? Jake thought about Emily Morrison, about the 17-year-old girl who had died alone on a rainy night, whose killer had walked free for more than 2 decades. He thought about her parents, who deserved to know the truth. And he thought about justice, real justice, not the kind that could be bought or intimidated into silence. Yes, he said finally, I'll help you. But we're going to need more than just your testimony. We're going to need evidence, proof that can't be dismissed or explained away. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. I might have something, she said, handing it to Jake. Jake opened the envelope and found a single photograph inside. It was old and slightly faded, but it clearly showed a dark pickup truck at the scene of an accident. In the foreground, partially visible, was the front end of Emily's red Honda Civic. I took this with a disposable camera I had in my car, Sarah explained. I was so shaken up that night that I almost forgot about it. But when I developed the film a few days later, there it was. Jake studied the photograph carefully. The image was grainy and taken from a distance, but there was something about the truck that seemed familiar. "Do you know what kind of truck this is?" Sarah nodded. "A 1997 Ford F-150 dark blue. I found that out later when I started researching Sheriff Hawkins. He owned a truck exactly like that one." Jake felt his pulse quicken. "Owned? Past tense?" "He sold it about a month after Emily's death," Sarah said, "to a junkyard in Dallas. But I tracked down the records. The truck was completely destroyed, crushed, and melted down. Very unusual for a vehicle that wasn't badly damaged. The pieces were starting to come together, and Jake could feel the weight of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about solving a cold case. This was about exposing a conspiracy that had been carefully maintained for more than 2 decades. About taking down a man who had used his position of power to commit murder and then cover it up. There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Something that makes this even more complicated." Jake looked at her expectantly. Sheriff Hawkins wasn't alone that night. There was a passenger in his truck. Jake felt the ground shift beneath him again. "Who?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I didn't recognize him at first because he was younger then and I only saw him for a moment. But over the years, I've done a lot of research, looked at old newspaper photos, tried to piece together what happened, and I'm almost certain I know who it was. Tell me." Sarah met his eyes, and Jake could see that she was about to drop another bombshell. "It was Mayor Davidson, Thomas Davidson. He's been mayor of Cedar Ridge for 15 years now, but back then he was just a city councilman. And on the night Emily Morrison died, he was in that truck with Sheriff Hawkins." Jake stared at Sarah in stunned silence, trying to process this latest revelation. Mayor Davidson involved in Emily Morrison's death? It seemed impossible, yet as Jake thought back to the events of 1990, certain details began to make a horrible kind of sense. "Are you absolutely certain it was Davidson?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah nodded grimly. "It took me years to piece it together. I spent countless hours going through old newspaper archives, city council meeting minutes, anything I could find from that time period. And then, about 5 years ago, I found something that confirmed my suspicions." She reached into her purse again and pulled out a manila folder. "I hired a private investigator in California to help me research this. He found some interesting connections between Hawkins and Davidson that go back decades." Jake opened the folder and found himself looking at photocopies of various documents, bank records, property deeds, business licenses, and newspaper clippings. At first glance, they seemed unrelated, but as Jake studied them more carefully, a pattern began to emerge. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a bank record dated 6 months before Emily's death. "Davidson took out a loan for $50,000 in October 1998. That was a lot of money back then, especially for a city councilman's salary." Jake examined the document. Sarah was right. $50,000 would have been a substantial sum for someone in Davidson's position. What was the loan for? Officially, it was for home improvements. But look at this. Sarah showed him another document, this one, a property deed. 3 months after Emily's death, Davidson purchased a piece of land on the outskirts of town for cash. $65,000. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Where did the extra $15,000 come from? That's what I wondered. So my investigator dug deeper. Sarah pulled out more documents. It turns out that in early 1990, just a few weeks before Emily's death, the city council was considering a major development project. A shopping centre that would have been built on that same piece of land Davidson eventually purchased. Jake was beginning to see the bigger picture.
Let me guess.
Davidson was in favour of the project, but it needed the support of other council members. Exactly. And there was one council member who was vocally opposed to the development, someone who had enough influence to kill the project completely. Jake looked up from the documents. Emily Morrison's father. Sarah nodded. Robert Morrison was the senior member of the city council, and he was absolutely against the shopping centre project. He thought it would ruin the character of the town, bring in too much traffic, destroy the small town atmosphere that Cedar Ridge was known for. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Jake could see the motive now, the reason why Emily had died. So Davidson and Hawkins were partners in this development deal? More than partners. According to what my investigator found, Hawkins had been promised a security contract for the shopping centre once it was built, a very lucrative contract that would have set him up for life after he retired from law enforcement. Sarah pulled out another document, this one a copy of an email correspondence between Davidson and a development company in Dallas. This email, dated 3 weeks before Emily's death, shows Davidson assuring the developers that the council vote would go their way. He guaranteed that Robert Morrison's opposition wouldn't be a problem much longer. Jake felt sick. The implication was clear. They hadn't just planned to silence Robert Morrison's opposition to the project. They had planned to destroy him emotionally by killing his daughter. It was a level of evil that Jake found almost incomprehensible. But why Emily? Jake asked. Why not just target Robert Morrison directly? Because killing a city council member would have brought too much attention, too much scrutiny. But a teenage car accident? Well, that was just a tragedy. No one would look too closely at it, especially with the sheriff handling the investigation. Sarah's voice was filled with disgust. They knew that losing Emily would destroy Robert Morrison, would break him so completely that he'd either resign from the council or be too grief-stricken to fight effectively against anything. And they were right. After Emily died, Robert Morrison became a shell of his former self. He rubber-stamped everything that came before the council, never questioned anything, never opposed any project. Jake remembered those dark months after Emily's death, when Robert Morrison had seemed to age 10 years overnight. The man who had once been a passionate advocate for preserving Cedar Ridge's small-town character had become withdrawn, defeated, broken. Jake had attributed it to grief, but now he realized it had been something much more sinister. The shopping center was approved 6 months after Emily's death, Sarah continued. Davidson made a fortune on the land deal, Hawkins got his security contract, and the developers got their project. Everyone won, except Emily Morrison and her family. Jake looked through the documents again, his anger growing with each piece of evidence. This is enough to bring them both down. Why haven't you taken this to the authorities before now? Sarah's expression darkened. Because I tried. 3 years ago, when my daughter turned 16 and started driving, I couldn't stand the guilt anymore. I contacted the State Attorney General's office and tried to present this evidence. What happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. My complaint was assigned to an investigator who happened to be a former deputy sheriff from this county, a man who had worked under Hawkins for 15 years before moving to the state level. My evidence was reviewed and dismissed as inconclusive and circumstantial. Jake wasn't surprised. Hawkins had spent decades building relationships throughout law enforcement. He probably had allies and former subordinates scattered throughout the state government. But there's something else, Sarah continued. Something that happened after I filed that complaint that made me realize just how dangerous this situation really is. She pulled out a final document from the folder, and Jake could see that her hands were shaking. 2 weeks after I contacted the Attorney General's office, I received this in the mail. Jake took the document and immediately recognized what it was, a death certificate. But not just any death certificate. It was for Maria Santos, a woman who had died in a car accident in Austin, Texas, just 1 week after Sarah had filed her complaint. I don't understand, Jake said, though he was beginning to fear that he did. Maria Santos was a witness, Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. The private investigator I hired had tracked down several people who might have had information about what happened that night. Maria was one of them. She had been working at a gas station on Highway 287 and remembered seeing a pickup truck speeding through town around midnight on the night Emily died. Jake felt his blood turn to ice. You think Hawkins had her killed? I think Hawkins found out about my investigation and decided to eliminate any potential witnesses. Maria's death was ruled an accident, just like Emily's. Single car crash, late at night, no witnesses. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. That's when I realized that coming forward wasn't just dangerous for me. It was dangerous for anyone who might be able to help prove what happened. So I dropped the investigation and went back into hiding. Jake stared at the death certificate, trying to process the magnitude of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just about a single murder committed in a moment of panic or rage. This was about a systematic conspiracy that had been maintained for more than 2 decades, with additional murders committed to protect the original secret. How many others? Jake asked quietly. I don't know, Sarah admitted. My investigator identified 4 potential witnesses, people who might have seen something that night or in the days following. Maria Santos was the first one he contacted. After she died, he refused to continue with the investigation. He was too scared. Jake thought about his own situation, about the fact that he was now in possession of this information. Sarah, by telling me all of this, you've put me in danger too. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. And I'm sorry. But I couldn't carry this alone anymore. Emily Morrison deserves justice. And her parents deserve to know the truth, even if it means risking our lives to make sure they get it. Jake looked at the documents spread out before him, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. The task of bringing down Hawkins and Davidson seemed almost impossible. They were dealing with men who had killed multiple times to protect their secret and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Love? But as Jake thought about Emily Morrison, about the 17-year-old girl who had died alone and afraid on a rainy night, he knew there was no choice. Justice demanded action, regardless of the personal cost. "We need help," Jake said finally. "We can't do this alone." But we can't trust anyone in local law enforcement, and apparently the state authorities are compromised too. Sarah nodded. "I've been thinking about that. There might be someone who can help us, someone with the resources and the independence to take this on." "Who?" "Jessica Chen," Sarah said. "She's an investigative journalist with the Dallas Morning News. She's built a reputation for taking on corrupt officials and exposing cover-ups. More importantly, she has no connections to Cedar Ridge or to anyone in Sheriff Hawkins' network." Jake had heard of Jessica Chen. She had won several national awards for her investigative work and had a reputation for being fearless in pursuing stories that others wouldn't touch. "Do you think she'd be interested in this story?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "Mr. Thompson, this is the kind of story that journalists dream of. A corrupt sheriff? A conspiracy involving multiple murders? A cover-up that's lasted for more than 20 years? She'd be crazy not to investigate it." Jake nodded slowly. "But we need to be careful. If we're going to reach out to her, we need to do it in a way that doesn't tip off Hawkins or Davidson. They've managed to stay ahead of this for 23 years because they've always known what their enemies were doing." "I've already thought of that," Sarah said. "I have a secure email account that I set up under a false name. I can contact her anonymously, provide just enough information to get her interested without revealing who we are or where the information is coming from." Jake considered this. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. "What makes you think we can trust her?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Jake an article on the screen. "Because 6 months ago, she published an exposé about a corrupt police chief in Houston who had been covering up evidence in several murder cases. The chief had powerful friends and a lot of political protection, but Jessica Chen brought him down anyway. If she can take on someone like that, she can handle Hawkins and Davidson." Jake read through the article, impressed by the thoroughness of Chen's investigation and the courage she had shown in taking on such a powerful target. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe Jessica Chen was exactly what they needed. "All right," Jake said. "Let's reach out to her. But we need to be smart about this. We give her just enough information to get her interested, and then we see how she responds." Sarah nodded. "I'll send the initial email tonight." "But Mr. Beer, Thompson, once we do this, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing this through to the end, whatever that means." Jake looked out across his ranch, at the peaceful landscape that had been his home for more than 30 years. He thought about the life he had built here, the relative safety and quiet he had enjoyed. All of that was about to change. But then he thought about Emily Morrison, about her final words, about the promise he had made to himself that night to find out what had really happened to her. Some promises were more important than personal safety. "I understand," Jake said. "Let's bring these bastards down." 3 days after Sarah Martinez had sent her anonymous email to Jessica Chen, Jake's cell phone rang at exactly 6:47 in the morning. He had been up since dawn, feeding the horses and trying to distract himself from the anxiety that had been gnawing at him since their conversation. When he saw the unfamiliar Dallas area code on his phone's display, his heart began to race. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of excitement underneath. "This is Jessica Chen from the Dallas Morning News."
"I believe you might be expecting my call."
Jake stepped into his barn, away from any potential listening devices. Sarah had warned him that if Hawkins suspected they were investigating him, he might have surveillance equipment installed at the ranch. "Miss Chen, thank you for calling. I received a very interesting email 3 days ago," Jessica said without preamble. "Someone claiming to have evidence of a conspiracy involving the death of a teenager named Emily Morrison in 1999. The center suggested I contact you for more information." "I see," Jake said carefully. They had agreed that he would be the point of contact with Jessica, since his name was already connected to Emily's case through the police reports from that night. "Mr. Thompson, I've spent the last 72 hours doing preliminary research on this case, and I have to tell you, what I've found is very compelling. Are you prepared to tell me what you know?" Jake had been dreading this moment, knowing that once he spoke to Jessica Chen directly, he would be crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Ms. Chen, before we go any further, I need to know something. How secure is your phone line?"
There was a pause.
"You're concerned about surveillance." These people we're dealing with have been covering up a murder for 23 years. They've killed to protect their secret before, and they'll kill again. I need to know that this conversation can't be intercepted. Jessica's voice became more serious. Mr. Thompson, I've been investigating corruption for 15 years. I know how to protect my sources and my communications. This phone uses end-to-end encryption, and I'm calling from a secure location. But if you're that concerned, perhaps we should meet in person. Jake considered this. Meeting with Jessica would be even more dangerous than talking on the phone, but it would also allow him to gauge whether she was truly committed to the story or just looking for a quick headline. Where? Jake asked. I'm driving up from Dallas this morning. Is there somewhere we can meet privately? Somewhere that wouldn't attract attention? Jake thought quickly. Cedar Ridge was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. If Jessica Chen was seen meeting with him, word would get back to Hawkins within hours. But there was one place that might work. There is an abandoned gas station about 15 miles east of town on Highway 84. It's been closed for years, and no one ever goes there. Can you find it? I'll find it, Jessica said. What time? Jake looked at his watch. It was almost 7 in the morning, and he needed time to contact Sarah and make sure she could be there as well. Noon? Perfect. Mr. Thompson, one more thing. How many people know about this investigation? Just 2 of us, Jake replied, myself and the witness who contacted you. Keep it that way, Jessica said firmly. The fewer people who know about this, the safer everyone will be. After hanging up, Jake immediately called Sarah on the secure phone they had purchased specifically for this investigation. She answered on the second ring. She called, Jake said without preamble. And she wants to meet. Today at noon. Can you make it? There was a pause while Sarah considered this. Yes, but Jake, I'm scared. Once we meet with her face to face, we're committed. There's no backing out after that. I know, Jake said, but we've come this far. Emily Morrison deserves justice, and her parents deserve the truth.
You're right, Sarah said, her voice strengthening with resolve.
I'll be there. The abandoned gas station was a relic from the 1970s, a small building with broken windows and a rusted canopy where gas pumps had once stood. Jake arrived 15 minutes early and parked behind the building, out of sight from the main road. Sarah arrived shortly after, her blue Honda pulling up beside his pickup truck. They sat in Jake's truck, waiting and watching for any sign that they had been followed or that this was some kind of trap. The paranoia was getting to both of them, but they couldn't afford to take any chances. At exactly noon, a silver SUV with Dallas plates turned into the abandoned gas station. The driver was a woman in her late 30s with short black hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked around carefully before getting out of her vehicle, clearly as concerned about security as they were. Jake and Sarah got out of the truck and walked over to meet her. Jessica Chen was smaller than Jake had expected, perhaps 5 feet 4 inches tall, but there was an intensity about her that immediately commanded respect. Mr. Thompson. Jessica extended her hand. Jessica Chen, thank you for meeting with me. This is Sarah Martinez, Jake said, introducing the woman beside him. She's the witness I mentioned. Jessica's eyes widened slightly.
You were there that night?
Sarah nodded. I saw everything. I've been running from it for 23 years. Jessica pulled out a digital recorder. Do you mind if I record this conversation? It helps me keep track of details, and it protects all of us by creating an accurate record of what was said. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, then nodded their agreement. Jessica pressed the record button and set the device on the hood of her car. All right, Jessica said. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened on the night of April 15th, 1999. For the next hour, Sarah recounted her story in detail, describing everything she had seen that night and everything she had discovered in the years since. Jessica listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting Sarah tell her story. When Sarah finished, Jessica was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had heard. Finally, she spoke. This is bigger than I initially thought, Jessica said. We're not just talking about a single murder. We're talking about a conspiracy that involves corruption, cover-up, and multiple additional murders. This is the kind of story that can bring down an entire power structure. Can you prove it? Jake asked. Jessica smiled grimly. Mr. Thompson, proving it is what I do for a living. But I need to warn you both that this investigation is going to take time, probably several months. And during that time, you're both going to be in danger. What kind of danger? Sarah asked. Sheriff Hawkins has managed to keep this secret for 23 years by eliminating anyone who threatens to expose him. Once he realizes that I'm investigating this story, he's going to start looking for sources. If he figures out who you are, he'll try to silence you permanently. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. How do we protect ourselves? Very carefully, Jessica said. First, we need to establish secure communication protocols. No phone calls from your regular numbers, no emails from accounts that could be traced back to you. I'm going to give you each a new phone with an encrypted messaging app. Use those phones only to communicate with me and keep them hidden where no one else can find them. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 small smartphones, handing one to each of them. Second, you need to be aware that you're probably already under surveillance. Hawkins might have someone watching your movements, monitoring your communications, looking for any sign that you're investigating him. Change your routines, vary your schedules, and always assume that someone is watching. Sarah looked terrified. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe we should just let sleeping dogs lie. Jessica turned to her with compassionate eyes. Sarah, I understand your fear. But think about this. Emily Morrison was 17 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her, and it was stolen from her by 2 men who put money ahead of human life. How many other Emily Morrisons might there be if we don't stop them? Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. You're right. We have to see this through. Good, Jessica said. Now, here's what I need from both of you. Jake, I need you to compile a list of everyone who was involved in Emily's case back in 1999. Police officers, paramedics, emergency room doctors, anyone who might have seen something that didn't match the official story. Most of those people are probably still around, Jake said. Cedar Ridge is the kind of place where people tend to stay their whole lives. That's what I'm counting on. 23 years is a long time to keep a secret, especially when you're not one of the main conspirators. Someone might be willing to talk if they think they're finally safe to do so. Jessica turned to Sarah. I need you to put together a comprehensive timeline of everything that happened after Emily's death. Every suspicious death or accident, every person who might have been a potential witness, every business deal that benefited Hawkins or Davidson. We need to establish a pattern that shows this wasn't an isolated incident. I can do that, Sarah said. I've been researching this for years. I have boxes of documents at home. Be careful how you access those documents, Jessica warned. If Hawkins has been monitoring you, he might be watching your home. Can you move the documents to a safe location? Sarah nodded. I have a storage unit in San Antonio that I rent under a different name. I can move everything there. Jessica looked satisfied. All right, we have our starting points. But before we begin this investigation in earnest, I need to make one thing absolutely clear to both of you. She looked directly at Jake, then at Sarah. Once this story goes public, your lives will never be the same. Hawkins and Davidson will be arrested, but they have friends and allies who might want revenge. You'll both need to consider relocating, changing your identities, starting over somewhere else. Jake thought about his ranch, the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The idea of leaving it behind was almost unbearable, but he knew Jessica was right. Some things are more important than staying comfortable, Jake said finally. I agree, Sarah added. Emily Morrison never got the chance to live her life. The least we can do is sacrifice our comfort to make sure she gets justice. Jessica smiled for the first time since they had met. You're both brave people. Emily would be proud of what you're doing. She gathered up her recorder and prepared to leave. I'll begin making discreet inquiries in Dallas, looking into the development company that built the shopping center and any connections they might have had to Hawkins and Davidson. In the meantime, both of you need to act completely normal. Go about your daily routines. Don't let anyone suspect that anything has changed. Jake and Sarah nodded their understanding. One last thing, Jessica said as she got into her car. If either of you ever feels like you're in immediate danger, don't hesitate to call 911. Even if Hawkins controls the local sheriff's department, he can't control every law enforcement agency in the state. Sometimes the best protection is making noise and attracting attention. As Jessica drove away, Jake and Sarah stood in the parking lot of the abandoned gas station, both lost in their own thoughts. They had crossed the point of no return, committed themselves to a path that could lead to justice for Emily Morrison or death for all of them. No regrets? Jake asked. Sarah looked at him with determination in her eyes. None. For the first time in 23 years, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. As they drove away in opposite directions, neither of them noticed the dark sedan that had been parked on a hill overlooking the gas station, or the telephoto lens that had captured clear photographs of their meeting with Jessica Chen. Sheriff Robert Hawkins studied the photographs on his desk, his face grim. After 23 years of careful planning and ruthless execution, his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. But he had survived this long by being prepared for every contingency, and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He reached for his phone and dialed a familiar number. "It's time," he said when the call was answered. "They're getting too close. We need to move to the final contingency." The warning came at 3 o'clock in the morning, delivered by a burner phone that rang once before Jake could answer it. When he called back using the secure phone Jessica had given him, her voice was tense with urgency. "They know," Jessica said without preamble. "Hawkins knows about our investigation. You and Sarah need to get somewhere safe, immediately." Jake sat up in bed, instantly alert. "How do you know?" "Because 45 minutes ago, someone tried to break into my hotel room in Dallas. Hotel security scared them off, but not before I got a good look at one of them." It was Deputy Marshal Williams from Cedar Ridge. He was carrying a gun and what looked like a syringe. Jake's blood turned to ice. Deputy Williams was one of Hawkins' most trusted subordinates, a man who had been with the sheriff's department for almost 20 years. If Hawkins had sent him to Dallas to eliminate Jessica, it meant that the conspiracy was moving to its final phase. "Where are you now?" Jake asked. "Safe house in Dallas. FBI protection." It turns out that my editor had been in contact with federal authorities about this story from the beginning. They've been conducting their own parallel investigation into Hawkins for the past 6 months. Jake felt a surge of relief. "The FBI is involved?" Agent Sarah Crawford from the Dallas field office has been tracking suspicious deaths in rural Texas counties for several years. When my editor told her about our investigation, she realized that Hawkins fit the pattern they'd been looking for. But Jake, they need our evidence to make their case. "What do you need us to do?" "Get to the FBI field office in Austin. Agent Crawford will meet you there at 7 this morning. And Jake, don't go home first. Don't pack anything. Don't stop anywhere you normally go. Just get in your truck and drive straight to Austin.